I mentioned before the unreliability of supplies, and that was really quite a big deal here. So the fastest ship that ever went from Hobart to Sarah Island was 9 days, but the slowest took 12 weeks. So they just never knew if things were going to arrive. That's why they had to do everything they could to just gather their own supplies out here. So wheat and coal were the main things they relied upon from outside of the island. And then, of course, firearms and things like that. So I'll tell you about 1826. Two important things happened that year. First of all, do you remember Matthew Brady? He escaped and said he was going to return with an army, right, and liberate everyone from this island. Well, in the end, he never returned. Right, became a bushranger instead. He started going on many adventures all around Tasmania. Gained quite a nice name, the Gentleman Bushranger of Van Diemen's Land. He was quite polite, apparently. People got really excited when he came to town. But he wasn't polite enough to escape the hangman's noose. Governor Arthur still didn't like him, and eventually he caught up with Brady and his gang, put them all to death in Hobart for their crimes as bushrangers, much to the great sadness of the convicts here, who were genuinely awaiting their return and liberation. All of them were hanged in Hobart in the end, all 13 of them, but one of them, George Lacey, in the end, he gave a very impressive speech to the people around him, told those around him to never give up the fight and to carry on the resistance. About the same time, a very important person arrived on this island. His name was David Hoy. David Hoy was a Scotsman born in Dundee. He was a master shipwright. He came over from working in Boston, Massachusetts, which was the leading shipyard in the world at the time. Here's puzzle number 5. The enigma of David Hoy and why on earth he was here. You see, he had a great job in Boston. He was independently wealthy, he was well educated, and most importantly, he was free. So why on earth did he make the decision to come to Sarah Island to work in the middle of nowhere with a load of convicts in terrible conditions? I'll just refresh your memories on the 5 puzzles before we go on. So first of all, escape attempts dropped to 0 in 1829. Punishment rates dropped by 90% in the same year. They were moved to a comfortable place upon the hill around the same time. They were building ships on an industrial scale here with forced labour, and they were being led by David Hoy, that master shipwright who'd come over from Boston. Does anyone have any theories as to why these changes took place? Sorry? Oh, the drowning. So, in the long term, that would have affected things. So a change in leadership is a huge part of it. But he did drown quite early on. That's 10 minutes, don't worry. We're not going without us. Someone else mentioned the location of the island, the geographic location. That was very important to the industry. A change of the way in thinking. These are all big parts of it, but we have to credit the convicts themselves for forcing the change. Right? It's very interesting because the speech that George Lacey gave on the gallows in Hobart, no one heard it here directly, became a convict story, a legend. By the time it fell on ears here, that was that hell on earth period, and the convicts were quite clearly inspired by it. Right? During that period, the convicts became organised and came up with a series of strikes against the authorities to force them to change. Right? 3 strikes went ahead. First of all, the convicts went for the medical leadership of this island. They discovered that Dr. Daniel, the young surgeon at the time, was actually embezzling bread from the hospital he worked in on Sarah Island, which meant he was exaggerating the amount of patients he had whilst receiving extra rations. He'd then gather those rations for himself, take them home to his cushy governor's housing, and feed them to his chickens. Quite an offence to the convicts who were on half rations at the time, but once they discovered it, they showed restraint. They avoided violence. They gathered evidence for months, gave it to their pals, the convict clerks, who handed it to the commissariat officer, Thomas Lampriere, who at that time of the year couldn't balance the books for Governor Arthur and had no choice but to remove Dr. Daniel from this island. That was a smart move from the convicts, and strike number 1, a big dent in the authorities. Strike number 2 came against the military. I already told you most of that story. It was actually the convicts who reported Major Champ for his trading. They put themselves at risk by reporting his trading with them, but it paid off. Eventually he was removed from this island. The commissariat didn't want to get in trouble themselves, so they removed Major Champ, and that was actually a huge shame on the military at the time, a huge dent in the military leadership. So that was strike number 2. Now the 3rd strike, and I think the most impressive, came in the form of sabotage against the great shipyards of David Hoy, the industrial heart of this island. See, at this point the convicts were good boat builders. They need to make a strong, steady ship. You load it with a rough-edged quarry rock. It would act as a ballast in the hull, keep it nice and weighted and steady on a high sea. The convicts had a new idea of a new method of construction for the next ship. They collected round river stones, not rough edge stones, but round edge ones from their surrounding harbour camps. Brought these back in the thousands, tons of it. Started loading these into the hull of a ship instead. Their theory was that these round edge stones wouldn't stay still. They'd easily shift once the ship was out at sea. There'd be a huge displacement in weight, and that'd be quite catastrophic for any vessel. And that is exactly what happened. The convicts successfully loaded a ship with round ballast, unbeknownst to the authorities, launched it into the harbour. About 4 kilometres up there, it started to encounter trouble. After about 24 hours, it started to show serious signs of capsizing. It couldn't be saved. It sank, and 3 lives were lost. Now, that was the third and final strike for the convicts, the third success, and for Commandant Butler at the time, it was the third failure. He couldn't negotiate. He was forced to resign. He was replaced by Commandant Briggs, a military officer here to bring order to this island of chaos. But he couldn't do it himself. And this is where that David Hoy character stepped in. You see, David Hoy, the shipwright, whilst he was in Boston, he studied Hugh and Pine. He was one of the first to think it was the future of all shipping, one of the best boat building materials in the world. At the time, this was the only place on Earth it was harvested. Still is one of the only places. He believed that if he came here, he could make his own ships under his own designs with his own workforce, those convicts. So he made the sacrifice to come over here. And for some reason, he thought differently to everyone else. It was quite ahead of his time. He believed that if he treated the convicts better and with more dignity and respect, not only would the industrial output improve, it would just be a better off point of view from a humane perspective. So it was David Hoy that negotiated on their behalf during this period of change. He became their voice, and he got them a comfortable place to sleep at night upon the hill so they could be well rested after a hard day's work. David Hoy demanded an end to those extreme physical punishments that left them broken and ruined for weeks afterwards. David Hoy even got them a pass to go fishing, something they weren't previously allowed to do, and now they could supplement that awful diet. And good old David Hoy, one of the best things he did in return for their hard work, he even got them a ration of rum and tobacco. All right, and they liked him for that. It was essentially an enterprise work agreement of the 19th century. They were never paid, but they were rewarded with purpose. All right, and as they were rewarded with purpose, violence became a thing of the past. Chaos dissipated, escape attempts stopped. They stopped wanting to escape, output improved. This island became a place of industry, education and training. It was essentially Australia's first unofficial TAFE college right here on Sarah Island. Now, Governor Arthur knew about that, but despite the fact, in 1829, he began the process